These words we're going to look at this morning from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9. As Jesus went from there, two blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him, and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their sight was restored. Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But they went out and spread the news about him all over that region. So I wonder if you can remember your very first real prayer. I'm not talking about the prayers maybe that you learned in church or before you had supper at home perhaps, or when you went to bed and said that prayer that your folks taught you. I mean your first real prayer, the time you really first cried out to God in a moment of need, said just what you needed to say to God, a prayer that wasn't prompted by anyone, wasn't listened to by anyone other than God, just you and God talking about what was really on your heart. So I remember mine. My childhood was pretty much shielded from much trauma and pain. It really wasn't until college that things began to fall apart for me. The small town bumpers that kept my ball in the row going down toward the pins, that bumper was suddenly taken from me. And I ended up in the gutter more than a few times. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I was no longer the big fish in a small pond. I was the small fish in a very big pond. I met all sorts of people who were smarter than me, way cooler than me, and a whole lot less naive about life. I remember walking back to my dorm room the first weekend when I was at school. We had a kind of a get-together party to get acquainted with the other folks in the dorm. I walked into my bedroom to find it reeking with marijuana and my new roommate sleeping with a girl he just met at the party downstairs. And suddenly I realized, Paul, you're not in Kansas anymore. But at least, my best friend, a salt of the earth girl that I had grown up with and who was a classmate all the way from kindergarten on up, at least she was there at school along with me. And she, in some ways, kept me having a sense of stability in a whirlwind of change. But as the years went by, a couple years through, the two of us began to drift away, and I found myself increasingly alone, unmoored, my childhood faith battered badly, bruised, and after a particularly difficult, painful breakup with a girl, I was shaken, distressed, and frankly a wreck. Well, one of my classmates saw the distress I was in, and he invited me to this weekend he was going to with a group I'd not heard of before called InterVarsity. And during that weekend, I heard, really for the first time, the gospel. Not just keep your nose clean and to the grindstone and God will be with you, but you're a mess. You're not going to get out of this on your own. You can't fix yourself. Are you ready to let me do my work in you? And I remember walking out onto a frozen lake, and that night, over a full moon, crying out to God for the really first time. saying, "Help me, God. I don't know what I need to do. I just know this isn't where I want to be anymore. Help." Now, I don't really remember all the words I said that night, but I do remember the intensity. I remember the honesty and the rawness of my prayer. That's what I mean when I talk about your first real prayer. Unfiltered, unscripted. It's all about what's going on in your heart and the need you experience. Do you remember your first real prayer? Well, there are all kinds of prayers in the Bible, but during this Lenten season, we want to take a look at some of the prayers that we find in the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to look at what they have to say about how to really have real prayer. Prayer that's raw at times, but real. And so this series was in some ways inspired when I ran across this book this fall called Rediscover Jesus. It's a little devotional book that's written by a Catholic layman by the name of Matthew Kelly. And it was such a refreshing book for me that I decided we ought to kind of make it available to all of you that are interested during this season of Lent. And so we passed it out the last couple of weeks. We'll have some more copies next week. You can get on Amazon and get a copy for your Kindle if you want to start right away. But it's 40 short, 2 or 3 pages at the most, devotional readings. We're not going to follow them each week. It's not really structured that kind of a way. But I want to invite you to take some time during this season to read that. You can do it in 5 minutes. We also want to encourage you, as you're reading through this book, to also read through the Gospel of Matthew, which we're going to be landing in during this season as well. Maybe you want to do it by yourself, maybe around the dinner table, maybe with some friends at a coffee shop. Maybe your life group would like to do it. You can join us right after the service for a kind of a large group gathering in the great room where we'll have an opportunity to talk about it there. But each week, what we're going to do here is we're going to look at one of these unfiltered, raw prayers that we find in the Gospels. So whether you're brand new to prayer and you really aren't sure exactly how it's done, or if you've been doing it a long, long time, I think we'll all find some things that we can learn about the kind of prayers that God is looking for, the kind of prayers that make a difference, a real difference in our lives and indeed in our world. So today we're going to begin with this prayer by these 2 blind men we meet here in Matthew 9. So let's begin. Again, it talks about it with verse 27, where we read, "As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, calling out, 'Have mercy on us, Son of David.'" Now, this encounter occurs just a few months into Jesus' ministry, and he is making his way through Galilee, teaching, performing all sorts of miracles. Matthew tells us right before this section that Jesus was enjoying great popularity in the district. But then, in the opening words of this section, we're told, "As Jesus went on from there." That is, even though he had been enjoying great popularity where he was, the crowds coming to him in droves for his teaching, to watch him perform his miracles, and still, he decides to move on. In fact, when you read the Gospels, you see this happening all the time. Jesus is always on the move. He's always going to the next town, the next moment, the next person, the next encounter. In fact, if you read through the book of Matthew, you're going to be finding him moving so quickly at times, you're just trying to get a handle on what he just said, and he's on to something else. But that's how he was. It's tough to keep up with him at times. You hardly have time to process one teaching before he's on to the next. But then, Matthew tells us here, 2 blind men followed him. Now, that couldn't have been terribly easy, frankly. I mean, it's hard enough to follow someone in a crowd when you can see them, but when you're unable to see, well, either you've got to follow their voice or the noise of the crowd, or have someone help you, lead you, so that you can keep up with this man who always seems to be on the move. But however it was, it's clear that they were very intentional with wanting to get to meet Jesus. They were determined to get to him, and so they followed him despite the crowd. And we are told they were calling out. That's the verb, the participle, and in fact some translations may have it as crying out. So in this Rediscover Jesus book I just mentioned, the author makes an observation that I really had never thought about before. He suggests that in the Gospels, particularly Matthew here, we find the very first Christian prayers. He doesn't mean the first prayers of Christian people. Those prayers happen in the book of Acts after Jesus has died, been raised, gone to heaven, and sitting at the right hand of the Father, and has established his church. But what Kelly, the author, is saying is that the first prayers, the first Christian prayers, were those that were offered directly to Jesus himself. I mean, remember, for thousands of years, when people prayed, they talked to God, who was in heaven, wherever that was, and to a God they couldn't really see and couldn't really hear. And those prayers were generally offered in special places like the synagogue or the temple or the tabernacle. And they were generally offered at special days like holy days or the Sabbath or something like that. And they were often accompanied with special sorts of words or ceremonies or postures, words that were deemed appropriate for someone speaking to the king of the universe, if you will. And so back then, in the Old Testament times, prayer was frankly a pretty daunting experience. But now, with the coming of Jesus, for the first time, people could simply talk directly to God. With Jesus, you could look him in the eye and just tell him whatever was going on in your heart, whatever you were feeling at that moment. You could look him in the eye and ask for any kind of help you need. You could be across the dinner table with him and ask him whatever question was on your mind. You could get in his face and tell him you were upset about what was happening. And so in the gospel, for the first time, you can see this praise and this confession and doubt and request spoken directly, face to face, to God. These are the first Christian prayers. And for the most part, as we go through some of these prayers in the next few weeks, we're going to discover that they are unfiltered, unprompted, without any ceremony, without any kind of scripting, because they were driven by people's needs at that moment. And that's what we find here in Matthew 9. The first thing these 2 blind men say to Jesus is, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." Now, when they say Son of David, they are making really a remarkable declaration, especially this early in Jesus' ministry. That phrase, Son of David, comes right out of the Old Testament scriptures because it was widely recognized as a reference to Israel's Messiah, that one who would come as Israel's king, make the nation great again, and sit on David's throne. In fact, this is the very first time that Matthew's gospel has someone using that expression for Jesus. Now, I'm not sure that they fully understood the implications of that title, but clearly they came to Jesus believing that he was willing and able to help them. But notice what they asked for. Have mercy on us. So mercy is a favorite word of Matthew's, frankly. He uses it 15 times. If you read through the gospel during this season of Lent, you'll see it 15 different times. Now, if you turned in an English essay and used the same word 15 times, your teacher would turn it back to you to do over and say, find a thesaurus, will ya? And find some other words. But Matthew loves this word, mercy. In fact, all the writers of Scripture love the word. So let's just take a moment to think about its meaning. Simple meaning is mercy is to have compassion, to be sorry for, to have compassion or to be sorry for someone. So mercy is something we feel for someone, for their need, for what they're going through. But it's more than just a feeling. It's not just pity. Mercy is more than that. It also involves some kind of a response to that need. And so we might say that mercy is compassion in action. See, mercy is the feeling that you have towards someone, and then your willingness to do something about it. So, for example, when that kiddo of yours is in the Little League and they are losing their first game of the season, it's the second inning, and they are behind 14-0, you invoke the mercy rule and put the whole thing to an end before everybody's embarrassment is kind of out of the roof. Because mercy is about feeling something and then doing something about it. But biblically speaking, the word is even richer than that. One commentator expresses it this way: mercy is aid rendered to someone who is miserable or needy, especially to someone without claim to favorable treatment. And so mercy is for people who need help, and they know they need the help. Amazing Grace, how sweet the song that saved a wretch like me. But it's also for people who have no right to demand that help. They are literally at the mercy of the person that they are turning to for aid. And so, in that sense, this cry for mercy is really the first Christian prayer. It's the primal prayer. It's the quintessential, the mother of all prayers, because it just says, Lord, help me. Now, most of us don't like to think about ourselves as miserable, but we all come to moments in our life when we need, and we know we need something. We need forgiveness. We need wisdom. We need healing. We need courage. We need help, strength. Or we know someone that we love that needs those things. And so we are desperate when we cry out those words. That was what it was like for me on that frozen lake so many years ago. And that's what it was like for these, as they said, Lord, have mercy. Now, for some of us, those words are actually somewhat familiar. If you were raised in a more liturgical Christian church, say a Roman Catholic church, for example, you prayed these words virtually every time you went to a service. Sometimes it's called the Kyrie eleison. It's Latin just for Lord have mercy. And it's part in the liturgy of the prayers for the faithful. And the priest or the celebrant might cry out or might say, Lord, we come to you today on behalf of those who are sick and in distress. And then the congregation pauses for a moment and thinks about some of the people they know who are sick and distressed. And then they respond, Lord, have mercy. Sometimes it's sung by cantors or by a choir. Lord, have mercy. Christ, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. It's a beautiful prayer, but you don't have to be in church to pray it. You can pray it anytime, anywhere, at any moment from your heart. Lord, have mercy on me. And that's what these two men do. Have mercy on us, Son of David. And that's where real prayer begins, with the cry of our heart. But then, something really interesting happens. Jesus ignores the request. Now, it doesn't say that specifically here in the text, but look at verse 28. When Jesus had gone indoors, the blind men came to him. When they had gone indoors, so here we have these two men. They're following Jesus, probably a bit of a spectacle of themselves as they try to follow him without being able to see. They're crying out these outrageous words, Son of David. And Jesus doesn't even seem to notice them. He doesn't even seem to hear them or to recognize their cry to him. Now you say, well, wait a minute. I mean, we know from the rest of the Gospels that Jesus seems to see everything, doesn't he? I mean, out of the corner of the eye, he saw those disciples shooing away the children that wanted to see him and said, don't do that, bring them to me. In the middle of a crowded synagogue, he finds one man that's got his hand hidden in his cloak because it's withered. He's in the middle of the streets walking through a crowd when he senses the tug of one woman's desperate desire for healing as she pulls on his robe. Jesus seems to hear and see everything. I mean, he almost always, when he sees and hears it, stops to deal with it. But not here. Not this time. It seems he just continues on his way into the house he's going to, leaving these men outside. Now, hold on to that observation. We'll come back to it in a minute. Verse 28, and when he had gone inside, the blind men came to him and asked, do you believe, and Jesus asked them, do you believe I am able to do this? Yes, Lord, they replied. So let's give these men some credit. They didn't give up, right? Even though it seemed like Jesus wasn't paying attention to them, they still went after him. There was some tenacity he shows here. Now, chances are, as is almost always the case, every house that Jesus gets into is filled with people. Remember the story about the house that was so full of people? They had to put a hole in the roof to let a guy down. And so almost certainly it's a crowded house, but these two figure out a way to fight their way through the crowd or to get someone to help them get to Jesus because they know they need Jesus' help. Finally, Jesus notices them and says, do you believe that I am able to do this? Now, in some ways, that's a kind of a silly question. I mean, look at what they've done already. They've followed him all the way to this moment. They've embarrassed themselves by shouting out, and they've made this outrageous declaration of who they believe him to be. I mean, it sure seems like they have shown to Jesus and everyone that they believe Jesus can do this. But Jesus asked them anyway. "Yes, Lord," he replied. Then notice what Jesus does. He touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you," and their sight was restored. So Jesus turns his full attention on these two men. And we're told that he touches them at their point of their need, at the point of their uncleanness. See, back then, someone's eyes that was blind, that was a kind of a center of uncleanness in their life. No one had dared, certainly, to touch these men's eyes for a very, very long time. But Jesus has no fear of any of that. He touches them at their point of need. It was such a personal thing. It was such an intimate thing. To touch someone who's blind right in their eyes. But it was just what they needed. "According to your faith, let it be done to you," he said. And then we're told their sight was returned. Their eyes opened. They could see. Probably for the first time. I don't know if you've ever seen a video, say on YouTube or something, of a person who's gone through some kind of a surgical procedure or medical miracle and is able to see for the very first time in their life, to see the sunrise, for the first time to see the faces of the people they've known and loved their whole lives. But almost always when they do, they just burst out with tears or cry out loud or laugh out loud, hug the people all around them as they see them for the very, very first time. And it had to have been that kind of moment for these two men. They woke up that morning unable to see anything, and now they can see everything. And the first thing they see is the face of Jesus. Well, it's a pretty good story. Fascinating, inspiring even. But what do we learn from it about prayer? So 3 quick lessons and then a personal application. First, sometimes the very best prayers are unfiltered. I mean, this prayer, "Have mercy on me," this came right from their hearts, right at that moment. This wasn't scripted ahead of time. It was raw. It was real. Now, to some people listening to them crying out, this was theologically wrong, blasphemous even. To some of them who heard these words, it seemed like they were politically dangerous words to say. To some of the crowd, it was probably just obnoxious to hear them shouting that over and over and over again. But these men didn't care about that. They were needy and they knew it. They were afraid and they knew they needed his help. And so they didn't worry about being politically correct or theologically astute. They didn't worry about whether it was socially appropriate to say such things. They just cried out to God from their hearts. Because sometimes the best prayers are just unfiltered rawness. Because Jesus wants us to pray from our hearts in the moment. Whatever it is we're thinking or feeling at that time, just cry it out. Now, there are times for carefully scripted, thought out prayers. Sometimes when I'm writing in my journal, I'll write out a prayer. I'll think about what I want to say and how what I've read in Scripture has revealed something I want to say back to God. And sometimes it helps with disciplining my thoughts and clarifying what I want to say or to think when I write it out. And so there's a place for that kind of prayer. And there's a place for formal prayers as well. In a public worship setting like this, with scores of people praying along with you, you choose your words carefully so that they will reflect what's on the minds of the people that are seated around you. And they will be able to identify and pray those words with you. And sometimes we pray prayers that were written by the saints hundreds of years ago as a reminder that we have a solidarity with the saints of the ages past. Those are all fine prayers, but there are times when we just need to let it fly without worrying about whether we have just the right words or say it in just the right tone. There are times we just need to tell God what's on our hearts, even when it's not pretty, even when it's not fully baked. And so if you're new to prayer, and if you're feeling a bit intimidated with the whole idea of talking to God, don't. I mean, you can talk to people, right? I mean, you know how to turn to a friend and to tell them what's happened to you that day, or to ask them a question you have, or to raise your voice when you're excited about something, or able to shout to get somebody's attention, or to ask for some help when you need it, or to cry out when you're in pain, or to laugh out loud when something funny happens to you. You can do that with someone else. You can do that with God. Just talk to him. Shout to him when you need to. Cry, laugh, whatever it is. Let what's going on in the moment be something you share with him. He loves those kinds of prayers. And so that's one of the things we realize. Sometimes the best prayers are unfiltered. By the way, that's the first blank. Relax, we're going to get to the next two real quick here. Most of the prayers are interactive. Notice how Jesus draws these men out. Now, I can't prove this, but I am pretty sure that Jesus ignored these men's initial cry to him on purpose. Now, I think he ignored them on purpose because he wanted to stretch out the interaction with them. Not just for their sake, but also for the crowd's sake as well. Remember how he asked them, "Do you believe I'm able to do this?" Well, of course they believed it. They've already shown that by what they had done to get to him. He didn't have to ask that question, but Jesus wants to give them a chance to say that out loud and to let everyone else hear that as well. And then when he touches them in such a personal and such an intimate way, and he spreads that whole interchange out. Because prayer isn't about getting things from God. Prayer is about getting God. About deepening our relationship with him. About interacting with him. Prayer is a give and a take. It's a back and forth. It's a listening and a talking. And Jesus often stretches that out. He doesn't always answer our prayers right away. He doesn't always give us what we ask immediately, or when we ask, or the way that we ask. He's stretching it out. He's growing us. He's drawing us deeper into dependence on him because he's more interested, frankly, in the conversation than just in the mere outcome. And that's the second blank. Most times prayer is interactive. Sometimes it's unfiltered. Most times God is more interested in the interaction. And then all the time, prayer is transformative. Now, when I say transformative, I don't mean so much that prayer changes things, although it sometimes does. What I mean is that prayer changes us. And it changes the people we're praying for. When it comes to praying to God, we want to, most of the time, have Him change our circumstances. We want better health. We want a new job. We want more financial stability. We want a relationship to be restored. We want wisdom for a decision. And it's fine to pray for those kinds of circumstances to change, but ultimately, God is about changing us. And what does God want to change us into? Well, He wants to change us into being people who are wholly devoted to Him, whole and healthy, happy with the kind of person He's made us to be. He wants us to become our best selves. He wants us to become the people He's dreamed about us becoming from the very beginning. He wants us to become a person that looks a lot like Jesus in our own skin. That's what He wants from us. And He wants to change us. And that's what happened to these men, by the way. I mean, they came to Jesus and they wanted some circumstances in their life to change. They wanted to be able to see. And by God's mercy gave them that gift of sight. But something else changed for them as well. Something every bit as dramatic as now being able to see. Look at the last verse. Jesus warned them sternly. See that no one knows about this, but they went out and spread the news about Jesus all over that region. Now, there's a couple reasons we don't have time to get into on why Jesus warns them not to tell everyone. One reason, main reason, I think, is that Jesus wanted just to slow things down so that the whole thing didn't unfold too quickly. And so He tells them not to say anything. But, of course, they do. I mean, who could blame them? I mean, you're blind in the morning and you have full sight by the afternoon. How can you not tell everybody about that? And how could everybody that heard about it not just be amazed at the whole thing? And so as a result of that, they became these witnesses. Now, that's an interesting thing to think about for a minute. The one thing you don't expect blind people to be are witnesses. But that's exactly what they become. And they end up spreading the news about Jesus all over the region. Their whole lives have been ones in which people have been looking at them as blind, but now they can see. And so they become witnesses. People their whole lives have had to lead them to wherever they needed to go. Now they are leading others to Jesus. I mean, talk about a transformation. And it all began with a cry of mercy. So I was thinking about this in light of my own life this last couple weeks. Many of you know, I think, that my wife Judy has been on home dialysis for the last year and a half, and we've been waiting for her to qualify to have a kidney transplant. Well, she qualified a couple of months ago, and we're thrilled at that. And I and her sister, my brother-in-law, also volunteered to offer our kidneys for her. I thought this would be a pretty simple thing. She could take any kidney. I mean, she's a kind of a universal recipient. I'm in good health. I don't think there's any problem with that. But then I got the news that I don't match, so I can't do it. Her sister isn't qualified or able to do it, her brother-in-law as well. We've had a couple people right here at church, remarkably, that have offered to do this for her. But I thought this was going to be kind of an easy-peasy kind of a thing, no big thing. And we find ourselves right now, we're just waiting for the right person or the right kidney or the right kind of circumstances. And I think, there's a reason that God is making us wait. It's so that we will be ever more mindful of our dependence on him. When he answers our prayers too easily, too quickly, well, we just kind of look to him as the guy that gives us everything we need at the moment we need it. But making us wait kind of makes us more mindful of the gift we're given and our dependence on him. And that's what these two blind men finally got. That after all those cries, Jesus really was ready to give them the sight they'd longed for their whole lives. I wonder what it is that is on your heart this morning that you would like to cry out to God about. We're going to celebrate communion in just a moment. And as we distribute the elements, can I invite you to think about what is it that's so deeply on your mind and heart that you need God's grace and strength and answer for? Is it forgiveness? Is it a new start? Is it hope? What is it for you? So we're just going to invite you to stay in your seats, and we'll distribute the elements down the row, and then partake of them as you're ready. And then while the rest of us are doing that, we're going to invite as well the folks who are going to be receiving communion for the first time, very first time, to come up here, and we're going to distribute the elements to them up here.